I think the other aspect of it is we had two really big architectural shifts in ML models over the last, I guess, 7 years now. In 2015 or so, diffusion models were really invented, which was the application of certain types of statistical physics models to AI. And that led to all the image generation products. So that's stable diffusion. That's why diffusion is in the name, right? That's Midjourney. That's all these, companies. And then separate from that, you had the transformer architecture, which was invented in Google in 2017.
Yeah.
And that was the architecture that really underlies the understanding of language. And so these are what people call large language models or foundation models, right? And so we had two big technology breakthroughs. Whenever you have a technology breakthrough, it takes some time, right? So I think it wasn't until 2019 that people really started implementing transformers, right? I don't know if you've seen that chart of number of ML and AI papers over time.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's this giant exponent. And so in all that noise, you have to pick out the architecture that's interesting right, from all those papers. So it takes a little bit of time. You experiment with it, you scale it, you try some use cases, and suddenly some interesting things start to happen. And also there's very strong scale effects, for example, with the transformer architecture that really emerge when you have massive scale of data that don't emerge at lower levels. So it just took a little bit of time. And then, OpenAI basically bet the farm on these transformer-based models. So that was GPT, right? General purpose transformer is what GPT stands for. And eventually you had GPT 1, 2, 3, and now we're on 3.5, and 4 will probably come out at some point this year.
But one interesting phenomenon there is we had Noam Shazir on the show pretty recently, fantastic episode. And it's kind of interesting to see Google or Noam at Google and others at Google come up with, the transformer model, self-attention, and kind of what has become, the canonical paper, attention is all you need. But then it's actually a startup, OpenAI, which went and ran with it. So there's some interesting unpacking there about like big company culture and startups bringing innovation to the scene.
Yeah. I think a lot of it was conservatism, right? Because Google had the talent, the capital, the compute, the data, all the resources to really build these things, and they built them internally. So for example, Lambda is a chatbot that Google had quite early, and it's similar to ChatGPT now, right? And Noam, who you mentioned, left to start Character, which is a chatbot company, I think in part because he realized that it was so compelling, but Google wasn't really moving to commercialize it, right? And so if you look at that paper, of the 8 authors on it, 6 of them have started companies. Right. And so you had this sort of exodus of people go and then say, okay, we can't necessarily ship something here for now, so let's go do it somewhere else. And I think there's been recent announcements now from Google saying, okay, we're going to start commercializing these things more aggressively and offering them more broadly. And
they didn't want to ship it before because of just safety and safety.
I think it's safety and perception,
Well, safety, I think, there's a whole other tangent which we can probably go on, which is like, sort of culture wars and perception and so on. But I want to maybe on the startup founder topic, the AI market map, so to speak, for 2023. What do you see? Because there is infrastructure, everything
use cases.
Starting from the hardware on to infrastructure, all the way to chatbots who can speak like Elon Musk to you. There's up and down the stack. So what do you see the map as right now?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you really want to start at the very bottom, then you have the semiconductor layer, and that's really mainly NVIDIA. There's a couple startups, Cerebras and Grok and a few others working in this area. I'm surprised that there aren't more startups actually on the chip layer. And there's a whole thesis I have around just the aging of that industry, like literal aging of the people in the industry as a driver of a lack of innovation. It's not just the people, but the institutions, and the lack of startup formation means eventually there's less and less startup formation. And so semiconductors, actually, there's very little activity from a founder perspective. And that may be one of the reasons there isn't a chip company that's emerged to truly challenge NVIDIA over the many years that it was clear that something should emerge. So anyhow, there's the semiconductor layer. There's obviously the cloud service providers on which a bunch of this stuff is built, who have either cloud GPUs or TPUs. Then on top of that, I think you really segment by 3 areas. There's image gen, foundation models, and then unfairly everything else. And everything else is everything from biomodeling and protein folding on through to robotics. And they're completely different in completely different markets, but I'm going to put them aside for a minute because everybody's focused on the first 2. And then within those first 2, you have people who are building both the underlying models and the applications like Midjourney and ImageGen, or OpenAI and ChatGPT plus the underlying foundation model, or the Codex stuff, that turned into GitHub Copilot. But you have this sort of platform layer of AI platforms, right? And that's OpenAI, that's probably going to be Google, that's Anthropic, that's a few other companies. And then you have a bunch of apps built on top of that. And those apps may be things like Jasper, which is tools to help marketers write content.
Yeah.
It's Copilot from GitHub to help you
Yeah.
write code. It's all these sort of tools to help you translate these models into actions.
So one, this is super fascinating because I think in some ways, the question a lot of people are trying to unpack is where does value, maybe a two-part question. One, where does value accrue to various parts of, this map that you laid out? Especially with the second part of the question, when you have some really large companies, Google, Microsoft, obviously, making deep moves. Some of these require like very deep capitalization. So where do you see value accruing? How do you see the mama players?
Mama.
I
You
don't.
can stick to Fang if you want.
Stick to Fang. I'm trying to meme this. I'm trying to help you, Elad.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
The mom players to jump
Yeah.
into this.
Yeah. So I'm going to make a prediction, which is probably wrong, right? And so,
We're going to put this on Twitter. There are a lot of predictions that are wrong.
no, it's great. I'll be like Twitter Damus. So I think I would kind of split. There's basically three real potential future worlds for the API layer. Because
Yeah.
the reality is apps, of course, are going to exist.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And there'll be different apps for different things. And some of the value of the app, like maybe the AI sales tool will end up being Salesforce, or maybe it'll be a new player, right? But there'll
Yeah.
be some apps that incorporate this stuff in a rich way and will create entirely new categories for legal and accounting and medicine and all these things. And in other cases, we'll be competing with incumbents, and sometimes the incumbents will win and sometimes they won't, right? So I'll put the apps aside because I think there'll be enormous value there. And I think that's non-controversial. At least I'm assuming so. I guess at one point of controversy there is people often say, oh, if it's just a wrapper around OpenAI, it's not that interesting and it's not defensible as a business. And I think that's actually a super interesting area because the workflow built around that wrapper is actually the important part.
Yeah,
of many
that's the
applications.
important piece. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't matter if it's a wrapper or not. I think there's just a lot of these. I look at it as just solving for mundane human labor and just like filling out fields, filling out description box, like, that stuff. It doesn't matter if it's a wrapper on OpenAI. If somebody's solving that entire workflow use case for me, I would use it.
Totally agree. Yeah. And some people think otherwise. So that's why I think like some people think it's controversial and like it seems reasonable.
It's fine. Yeah.
On the AI layer, on the API layer, there's three potential worlds. One world is it's TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Corp, like where all the value aggregates to one player with enormous scale, and it's not really a competitive market. And you could argue the most likely candidate today for that would be OpenAI because they're the only 1 billion market.
Yep.
There's Anthropic and others who are now coming, and if Google enters, obviously that changes. The second view of the world, which I think is the most likely one, is that it's an oligopoly market. There's multiple players competing with each other. And the most likely competitors are OpenAI aligned with Microsoft, Google, and then I'm assuming that these things will get integrated into all the cloud providers. So Azure, AWS,
Yeah.
and GCP.
Yeah.
And so Google will have its own solution. Microsoft is now with OpenAI. And so that means AWS or Amazon may need to partner with somebody. And so that's Anthropic, or they already have a deal with Stability. It may be a different approach. For them to enter the market, and then there may be an independent player that's just running on its own, right? That's a second view of the world, which I think is most likely. And then a third view of the world is, well, we're gonna scale doesn't matter, and the cost of building these things won't keep going up. Some friend of mine keeps saying that's his contrarian viewpoint on this, and therefore it fragments into a bunch of niche models doing very specialized things, and there's a few big giant open source models, and that's the future. I think that may be the future in a very long time from now. However you want to define long time in technology cycles. Because I think the most similar analogy to all this is the semiconductor world, where in the 90s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, the microprocessor on your computer was highly differentiated if it was one generation ahead.
Yeah.
In other words, Intel was always a generation ahead of
Ahead of
AMD and others.
everybody else.
It cost 10 times as much to buy that specific chip. It was very proprietary. You built a factory to build these chips that cost billions of dollars. And each fab cost more than the last one. So it went from 100 million to $500 million to $1 billion, et cetera. And so you had a real capital moat. Nobody could enter the market, right? And the most recent generation of chips everybody would buy would be super expensive. And then a generation or two later, it's 10 cents on the dollar or a penny on the dollar, and everybody could use it for everything.
Yeah.
I think the models are going to be the same. If you assume that GPT-4 from scratch would cost, I'm making up a number, $50, $100 million to build, with all the errors you make the first time around, whatever. And then a GPT-5 equivalent is 200 million, and GPT-6 is 500, and GPT-7 is $1 billion, or whatever curve you want to extrapolate. That means eventually you have these big capital moats. But each earlier generation model is going to be dramatically cheaper to train. So if you have GPT-7, training a GPT-5 or GPT-4 equivalent may be $1 million.